Beneath the powdered wigs, perfect diction, and polished smiles of Britain's most beloved actors was a truth no one dared to script. For decades, they stood center stage, adored by millions, while hiding a secret behind the curtain. This isn't just about fame, it's about survival. About the cost of applause when the audience only loves half of you. These were actors who changed culture while erasing themselves from it. And now, decades later, their stories whisper back through the spotlight they were never allowed to fully stand in. Welcome to the truth they never got to tell. Before we dive in, take a second to subscribe if you love stories that history tried to bury. It helps more than you know. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? We're guessing it's late. These kinds of stories always find you when the world's a little quieter. 1. Sir Noel Coward. Sir Noel Coward was many things: playwright, composer, actor, wit, but above all, he was immaculate. Immaculate in manner, in dress, in the way he could enter a room and make it feel like a performance. Even when he wasn't on stage, Coward's life was a script he'd written just for himself, tight, elegant, clever, and sealed at the edges. Born in 1899, Coward shaped the theatrical world of the 20th century with arched eyebrows and arched dialogue, crafting biting comedies while maintaining a famously inscrutable private life. He described himself as a man of the world, but never said which world he meant. His lifelong partnership with actor Graham Payne was widely whispered about and documented later posthumously, of course. Coward kept things close to the chest, often laughing off questions with a martini in hand and a sideways glance that said, "Wouldn't you like to know?" The truth was, he couldn't say it. Not then. In the Britain he rose through, being openly anything outside the heterosexual frame wasn't just risky, it was unthinkable. Homosexuality was criminalized, yes, but even more crushing was the social death it promised. Newspapers that would run you on the front page, and employers who'd quietly let the phone stop ringing. So Coward lived in plain sight, wrapped in silk sarcasm and double entendres. When asked later in life why he never addressed the question directly, he shrugged. "There are still a few old ladies in Worthing who don't know," he said. "Let's not disillusion them. A punchline, a defense, a mask." But behind that mask was a man who mastered performance because he never had the luxury to live unguarded. The applause may have been thunderous, but it was also a convenient distraction from the silence beneath it. And speaking of men who learned to survive in silence, let's turn to another towering presence, who carried his own secrets all the way to Buckingham Palace, Sir John Gielgud. 2. Sir John Gielgud. If the British stage had royalty, Sir John Gielgud was both sovereign and subject, revered, knighted, and constantly tiptoeing across the tightrope of reputation. Born in 1904 into a family of theatrical legends, Gielgud was born to speak Shakespeare. His voice, clear as a cathedral bell, was made for kings, tyrants, and poets. But offstage, Gielgud was a man haunted by the brutal realities of the very nation he helped entertain. In 1953, at the height of his fame, Gielgud was arrested for importuning, a vague but damning legal term used to punish gay men for merely existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a sting, a setup, a ritual humiliation played out in courtrooms and tabloids, and Gielgud, one of the greatest voices of the century, suddenly found himself silenced by shame. The story was everywhere, every newspaper, every whisper behind velvet curtains. His name, once associated with Hamlet and Lear, now echoed in the same breath as disgrace. He contemplated leaving the stage forever. But in a twist that seems almost cinematic, Queen Elizabeth II herself is said to have intervened quietly, urging him to continue. And so, Gielgud returned. Apologetic, mortified, but undefeated. The audience forgave him, or perhaps, more accurately, pretended nothing had happened. That was the British way. He would never again speak openly of that night. Even after homosexuality was decriminalized in 1967, Gielgud stayed silent. The fear had been carved too deeply. His diaries, revealed after his death in 2000, tell of loneliness, coded desires, and a constant anxiety that any moment of truth might undo everything he had built. Yet he never stopped performing. He wore his roles like armor, each character a way to keep the world at bay. And when the curtain fell, he stepped off stage, alone again. But what happens when an actor decides not just to hide but to reinvent the entire script? Enter Dirk Bogarde. 2 stories in, and already the silence feels louder, doesn't it? If you're still with us, hit that subscribe button. There's a lot more where this came from. And while you're watching, drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Are you watching in the middle of the night like these actors once lived quietly, carefully, after hours? We're listening. 3. Dirk Bogarde. Dirk Bogarde didn't just play characters. He played the system. Handsome, brooding, and devastatingly precise, Bogarde rose through the post-war British film industry like a silent detonation, charming, aloof, and never quite what you thought. To audiences, he was the quintessential Englishman, composed, masculine, sometimes tormented, always desirable. But behind the velvet rope of fame, there was an entirely different performance underway. Bogarde's defining work, ironically, and perhaps intentionally, was Victim 1961, the first English-language film to directly confront the criminalization of homosexuality. He played a closeted lawyer being blackmailed. The role was dangerous, taboo, bold, and entirely too close to home. Bogarde claimed it was just acting, but even then, his voice wavered. When asked about the character's sexuality in later interviews, he danced around the topic like a man afraid of setting off a tripwire. The truth was already known to some. He lived for nearly 4 decades with his manager and partner, Anthony Forwood, in what the press coyly described as a bachelor household. The two were inseparable. Their relationship, though never publicly defined, was an open secret inside a closed society. Bogarde denied, deflected, and distanced himself from the very thing he embodied on screen. And yet, his later work, particularly in The Servant and Death in Venice, reeked of repression, desire, and coded longing. His roles got colder, more brutal, more haunted. It was the only safe way to tell the truth. In the end, Bogarde became his own greatest illusion, a man who used cinema to say what he could never admit aloud, a ghost in plain sight. But every magician needs a mirror, and behind Bogarde's carefully constructed reflection stood the man who knew him better than anyone else, Anthony Forwood. 4. Anthony Forwood. Anthony Forwood was never meant to be a mystery. In another life, he might have been remembered as a reliable screen presence from the 1,940 seconds and 50 seconds, handsome, polite, impeccably British. Instead, he became one of the great shadows of 20th century cinema, known less for what he did on screen than for who he shared his life with behind closed doors. Forwood was Dirk Bogarde's partner, confidant, and co-conspirator in the long, careful act of survival. While Bogarde became a national icon, Forwood disappeared into the margins. His name faded into stage directions and captioned photographs, the friend, the manager, the housemate. He played his most significant role without billing, keeping the world at bay while the two of them lived in tandem, behind tightly drawn curtains and well-tended hedges. It was not just discretion, it was necessity. Britain in the mid-20th century did not reward truth. Careers ended on rumor alone. Forwood understood the stakes, and so did Bogarde. They built a life around quiet understanding, silence, and coded routines. A life full of art, gardens, handwritten notes, and unspoken agreements. When Forwood became ill in the 1,980 seconds, Bogarde cared for him until the end, privately, fiercely, and of course without fanfare. There were no red carpet tributes, no obituaries that gave him his due. He was not a tragedy or a scandal or a headline. He was, simply, the man who stood beside someone more famous and bore the weight of that invisibility. He never got to reclaim his narrative. But perhaps that's the point. In a time when speaking out meant erasure, Forwood chose something else. Presence, loyalty, a quiet kind of love that left no press release, only proof. And while Forwood disappeared from public view, his legacy lived on in diaries, photographs, and the very architecture of Dirk Bogart's career, a legacy of silence and resilience. And now, from the stillness of a man who stayed silent, we turn to a voice that never quite stopped talking, even when the truth was almost too hard to say. Kenneth Williams. 5. Kenneth Williams. Kenneth Williams didn't speak, he broadcast. Every vowel was projected, every line hit with theatrical precision. As one of the most beloved voices in British comedy, Williams starred in over 24 carry-on films, voiced radio characters by the dozen, and held court on talk shows like a man allergic to silence. But the louder he laughed, the more you had to wonder what he was drowning out. Born in 1926 and raised in a working-class home where attention was a rare currency, Williams learned early how to perform his way through discomfort. He became a national treasure and a paradox, openly camp, but tightly closeted. On screen, he was flamboyant, irreverent, and fearless. Off screen, he was haunted, withdrawn, and deeply private. His diaries, locked away during his life and later published, reveal a staggering emotional complexity. They chronicle his loneliness, frustration, and relentless self-scrutiny. He was proud and ashamed, confident and tormented, devoutly private yet obsessed with being remembered. He didn't just fear scandal, he feared being misunderstood. Williams never publicly acknowledged his sexuality, but the clues were there, layered between the jokes. He lived alone. He built emotional barricades. He hinted, in coded phrases and rueful asides, at something always just beyond the frame. And when the laughter faded, what remained was a man who never really let himself be seen. His life was a study in controlled exposure, every facial expression calculated, every anecdote rehearsed, yet the emotion that trickled through was raw, desperate, and sometimes cruelly funny. He was a man allergic to intimacy, but desperate to be known. He remains one of Britain's most iconic comic voices, but his story is a cautionary tale in disguise, a reminder that even the loudest laughs can be echoes of things unsaid. And as we step further into the realm of those silences, let's meet one who kept even tighter control of the script, Wilfrid Brambell. 6. Wilfrid Brambell. Wilfrid Brambell was many things: an actor, a recluse, a contradiction wrapped in a brown overcoat. But most famously, he was the grumbling, grimy, dirty old man from Steptoe and Son, the BBC sitcom that ran throughout the 1,960 seconds and into the 70 seconds. It made him a household name. It also locked him inside a persona that left little room for truth. Born in 1,912 inches Dublin, Brambell became part of British TV's working-class canon, a man playing a character who was supposedly coarse, uneducated, and comically outdated. Off-screen, though, Brambell was far from the character he played. He was articulate, particular, and known in theater circles as far more refined than his on-screen alter ego suggested. But there was a different kind of distance, too, one between public perception and private reality. In 1962, Brambell was arrested in what was then referred to, euphemistically, as a public morals case. It was never fully elaborated in the press, but the implications were unmistakable. Charges were brought, and quickly hushed. The BBC kept him on. The tabloids, in a rare act of selective blindness, mostly looked the other way. Still, something shifted. Brambell became even more private. He gave few interviews. He avoided the press. He denied what others speculated, and lived alone until his death in 1985. There were rumors, of course, about his orientation, his loneliness, his mood swings. None of them stuck, but none of them went away either. His obituary was polite, but distant. It focused on Steptoe and stage work. His private life was left untouched, just as he might have wanted. Brambell didn't have the luxury of reinvention. He had only the option of retreat. And yet, for the next man on our list, retreat wasn't enough. Peter Wyngarde didn't just survive the scrutiny, he turned it into spectacle. 7. Peter Wyngarde. Peter Wyngarde was the sort of actor who seemed less like a person and more like a carefully curated myth. With a velvet voice, perfectly waxed mustache, and an outfit that looked like it had been hand-picked by a Bond villain with a flair for opera, Wyngarde exuded decadent charisma. He starred in Department S and its spin-off Jason King, playing a flamboyant, over-the-top sleuth with champagne in one hand and a cigarette holder in the other. For a time in the early 1970 seconds, Wingard was everywhere: talk shows, fan magazines, autograph sessions, and then, almost without warning, he wasn't. There was a reason for the vanishing act. In 1975, he was convicted under the same vague legal codes that had snared others before him: gross indecency, the official term. The British press treated it with a strange, polite cruelty, never fully naming the implications, yet leaving just enough breadcrumbs for readers to follow. Wingard didn't speak about it publicly. Instead, he denied everything, or rather, he distorted it. In later years, he gave surreal interviews claiming he had never been gay, only pretending for art, or that the whole thing had been a misunderstanding involving foreign customs. The truth became another layer in the performance. He lived out his later years in quiet obscurity, far from the sets and fan clubs. When asked why he never addressed his private life more clearly, Wingard deflected. "Why should I explain myself?" he said. "What's interesting about privacy is keeping it." There was no public redemption arc, no confessional memoir, just the fading glamour of a man who had built his career on spectacle, only to be undone by the need to hide. A star who disappeared, not in disgrace, but in exhaustion. And from a man who played mystery like a symphony, we moved to one who wore the burden of secrecy like an old coat, heavy, frayed, but never discarded. Denholm Elliott. 7 stories in, and it's starting to feel less like coincidence and more like a pattern, isn't it? If you're finding this as haunting and human as we are, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss what's still to come. And while you're at it, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Is it just past midnight in Glasgow, dawn breaking in Sydney? These hidden lives have a strange way of finding us when the world goes quiet. 8. Denholm Elliott. Denholm Elliott was the kind of actor who could do anything: an aristocrat in one film, a vagabond in the next, always disappearing into his roles without a trace of vanity. Best known to modern audiences as Marcus Brody in Raiders of the Lost Ark, Elliott had a face that seemed carved from the middle of the 20th century, weathered, wise, quietly expressive. He worked constantly, often brilliantly, and always under the radar, which, as it turns out, suited him perfectly. Born in 1922 and trained at RADA, Elliott spent most of his career in supporting roles, the kind that didn't invite tabloids or fanfare, and maybe that was intentional. The press rarely pried into his personal life during his lifetime, but those who knew him describe a man of great emotional depth, haunted by the impossibility of openness. After his death in 1992, obituaries acknowledged his sexuality with a kind of respectful understatement. His long-term relationship was treated as fact, not speculation, though it was rarely mentioned when he was alive. Why the silence? Because the system rewarded silence. Because every casting agent wanted discretion, not disruption. Because audiences, even in the late 80 seconds, were still uneasy about the people behind the performances. Elliott wasn't hiding, exactly. He was editing, removing pieces of himself that didn't fit the narrative being sold on screen. He died relatively young, from AIDS-related complications, though that too was sanitized in many of the obituaries. Even in death, he was treated like a man whose privacy deserved protection. Maybe he did. Maybe that's the tragedy. And yet, the roles he chose in later life, melancholic, tragic, complex, suggest a man who was trying to say something, even if the words weren't allowed, a message hidden in plain sight. And speaking of messages, the next man on our list spent his entire career delivering them with a raised eyebrow and an unsettling amount of accuracy: Nigel Hawthorne. 9. Nigel Hawthorne. Nigel Hawthorne could command a room without ever raising his voice. With the meticulous poise of a man who knew the cost of missteps, he played civil servants, kings, and neurotics with an intensity that always seemed to suggest something hidden just beneath the surface. Best known for Yes, Minister and The Madness of King George, Hawthorne was a master of portraying men hemmed in by decorum and bureaucracy, ironically, not far off from his own lived experience. Born in 1929 and raised in South Africa before returning to Britain, Hawthorne didn't speak publicly about his sexuality until very late in life, Far too late, in fact, to have spared him the anxieties that haunted his earlier career. He lived for many years with his partner, Trevor Bentham, but never introduced him that way in public. Friend, colleague, flatmate, the usual code words were employed, not because Hawthorne lacked pride, but because the world around him lacked permission. In 1995, when he was nominated for an Academy Award, the press suddenly became very interested in his personal life. The intrusion was so jarring that it reportedly left him shaken. He had spent decades building a career based on restraint, precision, and carefully managed public exposure. Now, all at once, the performance was being interrupted. Eventually, he did acknowledge his relationship quietly, firmly, without spectacle, but by then, the strain had already marked him. Hawthorne's late-life roles carried a kind of ache, as if each line was weighted with the burden of having waited too long to be himself. He died in 2001, respected, decorated, and still somewhat enigmatic, a man who lived in footnotes, even as he delivered headlines. Next, we turn to someone who would one day wear openness as a badge of honor, but only after years spent pretending otherwise. Sir Ian McKellen. 10. Sir Ian McKellen. Sir Ian McKellen's name today is almost inseparable from the word icon. Gandalf, Magneto, Shakespearean legend, national treasure, pick your title, he's earned them all. But before he was the global face of dignity, power, and wizardry, McKellen was something else entirely. A man playing by invisible rules, in a country that liked its actors talented, charming, and entirely opaque about their personal lives. Born in 1,939 inches, Lancashire, McKellen was drawn to the theatre early. His talent was undeniable. By the 1,970 seconds, he was already considered one of Britain's finest stage actors. But despite the growing fame, the question of identity hung over his life like a draft in a locked room. He kept quiet, not because he was ashamed, but because he knew the cost. Public acknowledgement in that era wasn't a declaration, it was a career obituary. Casting directors were watching, so were tabloids, and they didn't need evidence. A rumor was enough. McKellen didn't come out publicly until 1988, and it wasn't a prepared statement or polished reveal. It happened during a radio interview while he was protesting, Clause 28, a piece of legislation aimed at suppressing the promotion of homosexuality. The law was vague, but the intent was loud. And for McKellen, it was one step too far. From that point on, he shifted, not just in life, but in art. He became a vocal activist, a patron of causes, a deliberate presence in spaces where silence had once ruled. But the decades before that moment were lived in a quieter, more calculated mode. He played kings, gods, and generals, all with the restraint of someone who understood what openness could cost in 1,970 seconds Britain. He came out not because it was safe, but because he was tired of pretending, and that honesty reshaped his legacy. Of course, McKellen wasn't the only stage titan balancing private truths with public acclaim. The next man wore the crown of classical drama and a mask of discretion for just as long. Enter Sir Derek Jacobi. 11. Sir Derek Jacobi. Sir Derek Jacobi has one of those faces that seems like it's always been here, watching history, narrating Shakespeare, surviving Roman plots, and Elizabethan intrigues. His performance in I, Claudius Alone, made him a British institution, and he followed it with decades of stage and screen work that showed a remarkable range. But if you asked him during his early fame about his private life, you'd find yourself gently steered back toward the theater. Jacobi was born in 1938, the same year as McKellen, and emerged from the same classical acting world. But where McKellen eventually took a sledgehammer to the closet door, Jacobi preferred to keep the walls in place for a while longer. It wasn't fear, it was habit. He had grown up in a culture where discretion wasn't just expected, it was drilled into you. Your talent was your passport, your silence was your visa. Though his relationship with Richard Clifford began decades ago, it wasn't widely acknowledged until much later, when they entered into a civil partnership in the mid-2000s. Even then, Jacobi kept things graceful, understated. He didn't need to make statements. His presence, his consistency, and his calm dignity did the talking. Throughout the 70 seconds and 80 seconds, Jacoby continued to play complex characters with a kind of stoic intensity that made people forget to ask about the man behind the curtain. It helped that he was brilliant. It helped more that he didn't invite curiosity. But like many of his peers, he didn't lie, he simply edited. Looking back, his career is a study in mastery, of craft, of self-management, of knowing how to stay just far enough from the edge. He didn't need to be loud, he just needed to endure. And from an actor who mastered the art of understatement, we pivot to someone who made flamboyance into a fine art, Frankie Howard. 12. Frankie Howard. Frankie Howard never met a double entendre he didn't love. His comedy was full of knowing glances, twitchy eyebrows, and catchphrases delivered like half-kept secrets. Ooh, no misses. Became not just a punchline, but a shield. Born in 1917, Howard rose through the British comedy ranks, with a style that felt subversive, even when it was wrapped in camp absurdity. But beneath the innuendo and giggling stage persona was a man burdened by a country that refused to laugh at the truth. Howard was gay. He also never said so publicly. Instead, he played a kind of national charade, loved for his suggestiveness, applauded for his cheek, but never openly acknowledged for who he actually was. His long-term partner, Dennis Hamer, lived with him for decades, managing both his career and his household. To the outside world, Hamer was his assistant, a description that became more surreal the longer it was maintained. The contradiction was bitter. Howard, who made a living on being outrageous, remained personally cautious, secretive, and sometimes tormented. Biographers have noted that he feared being found out, even after homosexuality was decriminalized. He lived through the worst of the legal restrictions, but the cultural judgment never truly lifted. And as a comedic figure, he was even more vulnerable. Audiences tolerated flamboyance as long as it was fictional. He once confessed, privately, that the fear of exposure never left him. Every time he stepped on stage, he wasn't just performing a comedy set, he was performing a version of himself that Britain would accept. The line between entertainer and mask blurred, until even Howard seemed unsure where one ended and the other began. His legacy is complicated, hilarious, heartbreaking, historically vital, and it leads us to another performer who made a national joke out of being unknowable, John Inman. 13. John Inman. To some, John Inman was the very image of 1970 seconds British comedy, cheeky, flamboyant, and forever teetering on the edge of polite society's tolerance. As Mr. Humphreys in Are You Being Served? He turned a campy, over-the-top sales assistant into a cultural phenomenon, with his signature line, "I'm free." Delivered in a tone that suggested much more than product availability, Inman became a national fixture. Audiences laughed, but not always kindly. Born in 1934, Inman came to fame at a time when gay representation on TV was mostly about subtext, not substance. Mr. Humphreys was never openly stated to be gay, yet the character was unmistakably coded that way. Critics debated, gay rights activists were divided, and viewers tuned in weekly to see what Inman would wear, say, or wink at next. And through it all, John Inman kept his real self almost entirely out of public reach. In his private life, Inman lived with his partner Ron Lynch for over 3 decades. But to the press, Lynch was referred to as a business associate, or simply not mentioned at all. Inman never came out during his career, and when asked about Mr. Humphreys' orientation, he dodged. "He's just very theatrical," he'd say, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His decision to remain private wasn't cowardice, it was survival. British TV comedy was notoriously punishing to performers who deviated from the image the audience expected. Inman knew that the character was only accepted because it existed in a kind of plausible deniability, too real, and the spell would break. After his death in 2007, his longtime partner was finally acknowledged in obituaries, confirming what many already knew. But like others before him, Inman had learned how to speak in silence. And from a man who made ambiguity his brand, we move to someone who built his whole act on gently poking at the British public's nervous laughter, Larry Grayson. 14. Larry Grayson. Larry Grayson was never out, but he was never in either. For decades, he performed in the twilight zone of British entertainment, a world where a man could mince across the stage, flutter his hands, and wink suggestively at the postman, all while maintaining the polite fiction that he was simply a lifelong bachelor. Born in 1928, Grayson emerged from the club circuit. His act built on monologues about unseen characters like Slack Alice and Apricot Lil. His routines were filled with innuendo and dodged specificity, much like his life. Grayson's charm was undeniable. He was warm, clean, and oddly safe, making him the perfect candidate to host mainstream shows like The Generation Game. At his peak in the late 1970 seconds, he was one of the most watched men on British television. But behind the pastel suits and catchphrases, Grayson remained intensely private. His sexuality was never publicly confirmed during his life, and he rarely spoke about relationships in any meaningful way. The jokes filled the space where intimacy might have gone. Biographers and close friends have since confirmed that Grayson was gay, but fiercely protective of his privacy. He had seen what happened to others, how the tabloids circled, how careers quietly ended. So he chose to keep the public at arm's length. He lived alone, avoided scandal, and focused on work. His persona allowed him to be accepted without being understood. There was, however, a loneliness to it all. Friends described him as gentle, kind, and occasionally melancholy. The very warmth that made him beloved also isolated him. He could never really share himself, not entirely. Grayson retired in the 1980 seconds and lived out his final years quietly. His legacy remains one of contradictions, closeted but visible, private yet adored. And next comes a man whose personal life sparked far more rumors than clarity: Alan Bates. 15. Alan Bates. Alan Bates didn't seem like someone hiding anything. He was rugged, charismatic, and perfectly at ease in romantic roles, often with women, always with intensity. In Women in Love, 1969, he even shared one of cinema's most famous same-sex scenes, yet somehow maintained his public identity as a heterosexual leading man. The trick wasn't in denying the truth. It was in never acknowledging the question. Born in 1934, Bates became a prominent actor during a time when British cinema was transforming edgier, more sensual, less buttoned up. He embodied that shift, bringing rawness to roles that might once have been played with a stiff upper lip. Off-screen, though, he retained a carefully curated ambiguity. He married actress Victoria Ward in 1970 and had 2 sons, but friends and biographers have since described him as bisexual. Bates's relationships with men were an open secret in some circles, yet never addressed publicly. He never came out, and he never denied. He simply let the myth do the work for him. The British press was happy to play along, preferring the romantic narrative they could photograph and caption. His career continued uninterrupted, thanks in part to this balance: enough mystique to satisfy tabloids, but not enough clarity to provoke backlash. In his later years, especially after the tragic death of his son, Bates grew more withdrawn. The openness that had once defined his acting never quite made its way into his personal life. When he died in 2003, obituaries noted his family, his roles, and his contributions to the stage and screen, but rarely his complexities. He wasn't erased, just edited. And next, we meet a man who decided to write his own ending to reclaim what others had whispered for years: John Fraser. 16. John Fraser. John Fraser was, for much of his career, the kind of actor you recognized instantly but struggled to place. With striking features and a polished presence, he carved out a niche as a dependable, leading man in British cinema throughout the 1950 seconds and 60 seconds. From his role in Repulsion to various period dramas, Fraser brought an understated intensity to his characters. But the most quietly radical thing he ever did didn't happen on screen. It happened much later, when he told the truth. Born in 1931 inches Glasgow, Fraser came of age in an era where secrecy was second nature. Throughout his career, he played the game: polite interviews, ambiguous personal references, the usual coded language. But unlike many of his contemporaries, Fraser didn't wait for others to define him posthumously. In 2004, He published a memoir, Close Up, in which he openly discussed his sexuality, his relationships, and the deep cost of the industry's silence. Fraser described the loneliness and absurdity of the public masquerade with a cool, dry wit. He didn't write with bitterness, just clarity. He wrote about the pressures to stay closeted, about friends who suffered for telling the truth, and about the subtle erasures that shaped their careers. It wasn't scandalous. It was honest. And for someone from his generation, that in itself was revolutionary. By the time the memoir came out, Fraser had long stepped away from the spotlight, but the book gave him the last word. Not because he was seeking attention, but because he believed that some things were finally safe to say, and some stories, if not told by the people who lived them, are quickly reshaped by those who didn't. From a man who wrote his truth late but loudly, we go even further back in time to someone who lived under scrutiny long before there were any conversations about pride or public identity, Ivor Novello. 17. Ivor Novello. Ivor Novello was a star before British cinema knew how to create one. Born in 1893, he was the kind of figure who seemed to step out of a dream and into the silver screen. Matinee idol, composer, actor, icon, Novello dominated the 1,920 seconds and 30 seconds with a romantic mystique that made women swoon and men study him with envy. But behind the eyes of Britain's first true movie star was a life crafted around precision, discretion, and selective revelation. Novello was openly adored, famously stylish, and consistently the subject of gossip columns. But the part they didn't print, at least not directly, was that he spent most of his adult life in a committed relationship with fellow actor Bobby Andrews. The two were inseparable, their bond obvious to friends and collaborators. Still, the press never said it. Britain in the early 20th century dealt with such facts the same way it dealt with most discomfort, with silence and euphemism. In a way, Novello's fame helped him disappear. He became a symbol, and symbols don't get interrogated. His physical beauty and artistic talent were celebrated, but his private life was treated as sacred territory not to be entered. For Novello, this arrangement may have felt like protection, but also isolation. Being a symbol meant never being fully seen. He died in 1951, just before the cultural tide began to shift. His funeral was an event, filled with tributes, flowers, and barely a whisper of who he really was. Today, the Ivor Novello Awards celebrate songwriting in his name, but the man behind the legend remains elusive, a carefully preserved myth built on a foundation of elegance and omission. And next, we descend even deeper into the past, to meet a man whose theatrical eccentricities were just one layer of a much stranger life. Ernest Thesiger. 18. Ernest Thesiger. Ernest Thesiger never quite fit into the neat boxes that early 20th century Britain tried to construct. Born in 1879, he trained as a painter, became an actor by accident, and lived like a Victorian ghost haunting a very modern world, known most famously for playing the flamboyant doctor. Pretorius in The Bride of Frankenstein, 1935, Thesiger cultivated an air of otherworldliness that seemed to repel clarity. He was theatrical in every sense, his voice clipped, his gestures peculiar, his aesthetic utterly his own. It's tempting to say he got away with it, because he was eccentric, and perhaps he did. In an era when homosexuality was not just taboo but illegal, Thesiger lived with a boldness that would seem shocking even today. He was married, yes, but according to numerous biographical and archival sources, the marriage functioned more like a social shield than a romance. His friendships with queer artists, his flair for costume and design, and his deep involvement in theater circles known for quiet tolerance all suggest a man who understood the rules well enough to twist them. Thesiger didn't exactly hide, he performed, constantly. He turned his life into a kind of gallery, full of embroidery, literally. He was a master of it, bizarre dinner parties, and calculated camp. He seemed to instinctively know that if you're strange enough, people will stop asking questions. But eccentricity has its own loneliness. Thesiger's diaries and letters suggest a man at once amused and exhausted by the effort it took to remain hidden in plain sight. He lived in a world that accepted his oddness only because it never looked too closely. And as the curtain falls on Thesiger's carefully controlled chaos, we turn to a man whose career ended just as the world began to ask harder questions. Ian Charleson. 19. Ian Charleson. Ian Charleson was a revelation. Not just because he was talented, though he was, stunningly so, but because he managed to bring stillness to roles that others would have overacted, and intensity to scenes that others might have rushed. Born in 1949, Charleson was a Scottish actor and singer who rose to international fame with his role as Eric Liddell in Chariots of Fire, 1981, a performance that radiated conviction and quiet charisma. But what audiences didn't see was the price he paid for living in a world still laced with fear, judgment, and the demand for silence. Charleson never came out publicly during his lifetime, but those who knew him personally and those who worked closely with him spoke after his death of a man deeply aware of the risks associated with being honest about his identity. In the 1,980 seconds, particularly in the British entertainment industry, being openly gay could still be a liability, professionally, socially, and medically. This was the era of headlines soaked in panic, when actors were told, in no uncertain terms, that discretion was non-negotiable. Charleson continued working steadily, appearing in Gandhi, 1982, and performing on stage with the Royal Shakespeare Company, his Hamlet drawing praise even from the harshest critics. But behind the acclaim was a man struggling with the pressure to remain invisible in the very industry that celebrated his visibility. His relationship with his partner and his personal struggles were known to close friends but absent from the press. His silence was not denial, it was self-preservation. After his death in 1990, tributes flooded in, many of them speaking about his gentleness, his wit, and his extraordinary dedication to craft. Later, as truth filtered out from private conversations and posthumous accounts, the full picture of who he was began to emerge. And now, from a man who lived in silence out of necessity, we turn to one who chose the opposite path, Simon Callow, who made being visible part of the performance. 20. Simon Callow. Simon Callow doesn't do small. Whether it's on stage, on screen, or in life, he fills the room, articulate, opinionated, and gloriously unwilling to shrink himself to fit other people's expectations. Born in 1949, Callow has made a name for himself as a character actor par excellence, known for his roles in Four Weddings and a Funeral, Shakespeare in Love, and a vast array of classical theater. But unlike many of his contemporaries, Callow chose not to treat his personal life as an off-limits zone. He came out publicly in 1984, a move that was still considered professionally dangerous in British entertainment circles. It wasn't a carefully timed press release or a defensive correction, it was in his memoir, Being an Actor. Callow didn't just mention his sexuality, he interrogated the systems that had kept actors closeted for decades. He talked about the cowardice of the industry, the coded behavior, the sacrifices required to keep up appearances. He didn't whisper, he roared. And yet, Callow's outspokenness didn't end his career. It complicated it, yes. There were roles that stopped coming, interviews that turned colder, doors that closed a little faster. But he didn't flinch. He kept working, kept speaking, and kept pushing against the idea that queer actors were only allowed to exist in the margins or in metaphor. His activism was never self-congratulatory, it was part of the job. For Callow, being an actor meant being truthful, not just in performance, but in life. And that decision, radical in its time, helped pave the way for future generations of performers who would no longer need to choose between success and authenticity. From one voice that refused to soften, we turn now to another, an actor whose talent carried across continents, but whose privacy was preserved with unwavering discipline, Brian Bedford. 21. Brian Bedford. Brian Bedford was the kind of actor critics described as sublime without sounding hyperbolic. Born in 1,935 inches Yorkshire, Bedford built a long, distinguished career on both sides of the Atlantic, equally at home in Shakespearean tragedy and animated Disney films. Most audiences remember him as the voice of Robin Hood in the 1973 Disney classic, an oddly suave fox with a voice that somehow managed to sound both humble and impossibly confident. But the man behind the voice was much more complex than his charming, anthropomorphic alter ego. Bedford trained at RADA alongside Peter O'Toole and Albert Finney, yet took a very different path. He gravitated toward the stage, particularly classical theatre, and eventually became a mainstay at Canada's Stratford Festival. In that world intensely focused on the work, and far from the British tabloids, he found space to exist without constant scrutiny. His relationship with fellow actor Tim MacDonald lasted decades, and while not loudly publicized, it was also never completely hidden. Unlike others who cloaked their personal lives in layers of denial or ambiguity, Bedford maintained a kind of quiet transparency. He didn't court the press, but he didn't lie to them either. Still, he came of age in a time when British actors were warned explicitly that anything too personal, too real, could derail a career. So Bedford, ever the tactician, focused on the work, the words, the roles, and in doing so, he created a space where he could be mostly himself, even if never fully acknowledged. He passed away in 2016, his obituaries paying tribute to his immense skill and the quiet dignity with which he lived. A man of classical restraint, even in a world obsessed with exposure. And next, we turn to another actor whose career spanned decades of transformation, but whose inner life stayed tucked behind a curtain drawn long before the spotlight ever found him. Stanley Baxter. 22. Stanley Baxter. Stanley Baxter was the sort of performer who could disappear into a character so completely that audiences forgot there was a man underneath. Born in 1,926 inches, Glasgow, Baxter became a master of impressions, accents, and transformations, dominating British comedy through the 1,950 seconds, 60 seconds, and 70 seconds. On screen, he was elastic one moment a pompous official, the next a bewildered everyman. Off-screen, he was rigidly controlled, his private life protected by walls built early and never dismantled. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Baxter did not rely on flamboyance or innuendo. His comedy was technical, precise, almost surgical. That distance wasn't accidental. He learned quickly that visibility came with expectations, and expectations came with risk. He worked in an era when even rumors could end a career overnight, so Baxter cultivated professionalism as camouflage. Interviews stayed focused on craft. Personal questions were gently deflected. His public persona became so tightly aligned with serious comedian that few dared to look past it. Only much later, through reputable obituaries and retrospective accounts, did a clearer picture emerge. Baxter was gay, deeply private, and determined that his work, not his personal life, would define him. Friends described him as kind but guarded, intensely loyal to a small circle, and uneasy with fame's intrusions. He never married, never staged a reveal, never corrected assumptions. Silence, for him, was not denial, it was strategy. As the entertainment industry evolved, Baxter quietly stepped back. He withdrew from television in the late 1,970 seconds, long before nostalgia circuits or public reappraisals could demand more access. In retirement, he lived quietly, avoiding interviews, letting his work speak for itself. His life stands as a reminder that not every story ends with revelation. Some people survive by remaining unexamined, and sometimes the cost of that survival is being remembered only in fragments, voices, faces, performances, while the person behind them remains just out of reach. And from a man who mastered disguise through discipline, we move to someone who lived at the margins of cinema itself, often unsettling, always unforgettable. Aubrey Morris. 23. Aubrey Morris. Aubrey Morris rarely played comfortable people. Born in 1926, he built a career inhabiting characters who felt slightly off, men who lingered too long in a room, who smiled at the wrong moment, who made audiences uneasy without quite knowing why. His performances in films like A Clockwork Orange and The Wicker Man cemented him as a character actor whose presence alone could tilt a scene toward menace or melancholy. Off-screen, Morris lived a life marked by friction. He came from a strict background and endured significant personal rejection early on, particularly from family members who could not accept his identity. That rejection shaped him. He became fiercely independent, emotionally guarded, and wary of relying too much on institutions, studios, families, or public approval that could turn hostile without warning. Unlike many actors of his generation, Morris eventually spoke openly about his sexuality, though not during the height of his career. His honesty came later, framed less as confession and more as explanation. He described the strain of living with constant self-censorship, the exhaustion of navigating social hostility, and the way that fear seeped into professional choices. There was no bitterness in his tone, just clarity. Morris never fit neatly into the industry's expectations. He wasn't a leading man, and he wasn't a comic relief. He existed in the cracks, and perhaps that gave him more freedom than some. Still, freedom came with isolation. He never enjoyed the protective shield of mainstream popularity. Each role felt like a negotiation, each public appearance a calculation. When he died in 2015, tributes emphasized his talent and courage, acknowledging the difficulties he faced without sensationalism. His life reads like a case study in endurance, a man who kept working, kept creating, and kept existing despite a world that often preferred he didn't. From someone who lived openly only after the damage was done, we turn to an actor whose warmth and whimsy made him beloved while his private life remained carefully, lovingly contained. Jeffrey Belden, 24. Jeffrey Belden. Jeffrey Belden had the rare ability to feel like a friend you'd known forever. Born in 1924, he became best known to generations of children as the eccentric, time-traveling wizard in Catweasel. With his wild hair, crooked smile, and gentle mischief, Belden radiated warmth. He played characters who were odd but kind, misunderstood but never cruel. It was an image that stuck and one that quietly protected him. Belden worked steadily across film, television, and theater for decades. He was reliable, affable, and largely scandal-free, and that was by design. For most of his career, his private life remained just that private. He lived for many years with his partner, Alan Rowe, but the relationship was rarely discussed publicly. Not hidden exactly, just unadvertised. In a time when being open could invite scrutiny, or worse, Belden chose calm continuity over confrontation. Those who knew him described a man content with that choice. He wasn't closeted in the tortured sense. He simply didn't believe his personal life was the audience's business. His generation had learned a particular lesson. Survival didn't require lying, only restraint. And Belden practiced that restraint with quiet confidence. In later years, as cultural attitudes softened, his partnership was acknowledged matter-of-factly in biographical summaries and obituaries. There was no shock, no scandal, just context finally filled in. It felt fitting. Belden had spent a lifetime making people comfortable. Even his truth arrived gently. He died in 2017, remembered for kindness, eccentric charm, and a career that spanned eras without ever losing its humanity. A man who proved that sometimes the most radical act is simply living well, quietly, and on your own terms. And with that calm, we edge closer to the final names on the list, stories where silence, companionship, and endurance take on even heavier weight. 25. Hugh Paddock. Hugh Paddock might be best remembered as a voice witty, sharp, and always a little too clever for its own good. As one of the stars of Round the Horn, the BBC radio comedy that became a cult hit in the 1,960 seconds, Paddock was part of a subversive revolution hiding in plain sound. His sketch character, Julian, paired with Kenneth Williams' Sandy, formed a duo that camped, quipped, and flirted their way into the British public's ear every week, flamboyant, suggestive, but somehow acceptable. The secret weapon? Polari. Polari was the coded slang of the British gay subculture, a linguistic shield forged from Italian, Romani, Cockney, and sheer necessity. When Paddock and Williams used it on air, the BBC either didn't understand it or pretended not to. And so, in a country where homosexuality was still criminalized, millions unknowingly tuned in to two gay men speaking a secret language over the airwaves, laughing in the face of censorship. Born in 1915, Paddock lived most of his life in the shadow of these constraints. He shared a home with his partner, Francis, for decades, but like many men of his generation, he did so quietly. The press didn't ask. He didn't tell. There were no red carpet appearances, no interviews about love or loss. He simply lived the life he was allowed to live and made the most of it. Despite being part of one of the most transgressive acts in British broadcast history, Paddock never saw himself as a rebel. He was an actor, a musician, a craftsman. He just happened to be living in a time where honesty came with consequences. And so he cloaked truth in comedy, vulnerability in performance, and connection in code. When he died in 2000, his long-term partner was named in his obituary, a quiet, respectful nod to a life that had always existed just off stage. For all the roles Paddock played, perhaps his most lasting was that of the hidden pioneer. And with him, the list ends not with a bang, but with the soft hush of people who shaped the world without demanding to be seen. Because maybe that's the mystery at the heart of it all. Not why they stayed silent, but how they managed to say so much without ever speaking.